Welcome to Psychologist Talks. On today's episode, I'm going to try to tackle the topic of complex trauma. Now, I know I've not shot an episode describing what is complex trauma and going into that, so maybe this is a little bit premature. Sorry if I don't have that. You can easily look this up. It is a very easily look-upable diagnosis, construct, whatever you want to call it. But it's really, as the title probably implies, it's me saying somewhere in the vicinity of, have we gone too far? Is this, while incredibly important and incredibly transformative for a field, are we collectively taking this construct or this concept too far to a point where it might actually do us longitudinal harm rather than benefit? Now, I know that this is going to be pretty controversial, and I would fully expect that I might get some dislikes on this particular episode, but we need to talk about this. We have to talk about this, and hopefully I do a pretty good job trying to play both ends of the fence here of like, there is a rhyme and reason why it's important and helpful, and then there is a rhyme and reason why it is potentially not so helpful and unhealthy. Now, how do I achieve this? Well, I'm going to enlist, full disclosure, and you'll see very soon, nothing to disclose. I'm going to enlist the help of AI. And part of that is fear, frankly, is like, if I'm standing on my own 2 feet, is anyone going to listen, or are they just going to see me as this like increasingly old white guy who's just against the norms and is just, contrary to be contrary? Well, I'm trying to have essentially some accountability by having a conversation with AI. I've already had this conversation. And so that's what we're going to do today is I'm going to posit, kind of, offer what I've offered AI, and then we'll walk through its responses, then my pushing back. And that's going to be divided into, I don't know if 4 is correct, but, areas, categories that we're going to go through, and those are going to be timestamps. So number 1 is the construct itself. So there's going to be a brief comment around how the construct is defined, like truly what is complex trauma supposed to be. And then, has there been a drift? So one's kind of more conceptual construct bound. Let me look through this to make sure I'm getting this right. The next one talks a little bit about, like, are we just talking semantics here? Like, why are we am I too preoccupied with a label? Are we too preoccupied with labels? Or is there some sort of benefit and importance to talking about the label and trying to be precise around it? And so we'll talk a little bit through that and the drift that might be occurring. And then number 3 is I asked Claude, is the AI that I use since I've shifted off of ChatGPT. I said, are there parallels beyond this field? So let's take the heat off of this particular topic and look to see, is this just totally unique to psychology, or does this happen in other areas that we could maybe learn from, or there's something human about what is happening. So that's number 3. And number 4, it goes into the summary, but I don't know if I'll timestamp that in particular. I probably will. But then I push back a little bit and say, oh, hold on. If we're talking again about healing and the importance of healing, I kind of push back on some of the notions that it's offering, often around this idea of victimization is a big word that Claude kind of throws back my way. And you'll hear me along the way in the other timestamped chapters, so to speak, kind of speaking against this, or pushing back, in what Claude is saying. And then so essentially number 4, I think, is just going to be Claude's response to that, and says like, well, I hear you pushing back, and I'm going to push back further and kind of see where that lands. Now, is that a perfect structure for this? I don't know. I don't plan these terribly well. The timestamps will ultimately tell. But I want to lay this out because I know most people don't stick past a few minutes. I mean, it's probably a miracle I've even got anybody past 4 minutes. And that's where I would kind of implore, listeners or viewers of like, you got to stick with this topic. This is not something that you can condense into 3 minutes. You just cannot. If you condense into 3 minutes, the spoiler alert here, we end up exactly where we're at right now because we condense these things into 3 minutes, into 10 minutes, and so on. And this is barely going to scratch the surface, and guarantee it's going to run at least 30 minutes. And that's the best I can do. So let me pull this up, and we'll get rolling here. Oh, helpful if I go to the top. So, I'm not going to show the whole thing. Essentially, I was kind of free associating and saying, okay, there seems to be, I'm looking for existential meets research, right? So you got to frame things to AI the best you can to try to get the response that you want. And my holistic sentiment is like, everything is trauma. Now, I write here, if you see it up here, I write, everything is complex trauma. That's not technically what people say, but it is this increasing trend. When I look back 10 years ago, this was not as common of a vernacular, right? Like trauma was definitely well past emerging onto the scene of how imperative and how important it is for us to focus on it, because we too narrowly defined it, and there was still a ton of stigma attached to it. So the field was going through this massively important evolution. But here we are in the 2020s, there's this increasing sense of like, it feels like we're drifting here, right? Like everything is always framed through this lens of trauma, and it feels discrepant with what I know about theory that has already talked about all sorts of other reasons why people can land on the very same problems but not call it trauma, whether it's attachment issues or relational ruptures, personality development, whatever it might be. There's more to this than just complex trauma. Far pre-existing this notion of complex trauma. And then I reflected to it some kind of split, and hence the different chapters. Part of me says it's just semantics, right? You meet people functionally where they're at. If they identify with complex trauma, it tells you something really important. And even then, you still have to ask, because you don't assume anything based on a label. You feel things out. And then when I treat people, it's not like when someone comes in and tells me it's complex trauma, I've got this strict protocol for complex trauma. And if it's a more traditional PTSD, I've got a strict protocol for that. They are all cut from the same fabric. They all look very similar. The process, how things flow do vary, and that's the nature of kind of psychodynamic work. We're not manualized, but they share so many common threads, whether it's just someone coming in with an adjustment issue, but kind of a chronic issue, the aspects of personality work, aspects of trauma and complex trauma work. They all, for me, share really common threads and themes. So maybe none of this matters, right? It's just semantics, but maybe semantics matter too. Help me sort this out. Essentially, it's like help me, Claude. Help me sort out what the hell how are all these thoughts? And hence, this is where we get the first three categories, right? Clinical accuracy, where are we at? What's happening? Is there a drift? Number two, the semantics. The functional clinical versus the semantic argument, and then are there parallels elsewhere in the field that we can look? So here we go. Chapter 1, so to speak, on clinical accuracy. So understanding is essentially correct. The concept of complex trauma, which is in the ICD. The ICD, by the way, is the Diagnostic Manual for Medicine, like physical health stuff, whereas the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual for us mental health providers, does not. Why those two got reversed, it's tragic in a way. It's such a bad reflection on the DSM, if you ask me. If you haven't seen my PTSD episode where I'm just talking about the PTSD as it is currently defined by the DSM, I comment on that. And I think I do. But, it's something like, I didn't look this up ahead of time, but my vague recollection is something like 80, 82, 85% is already shared by PTSD. So the DSM panel said, like, we're not going to include it because that's way too much overlap, which is it just feels totally off. I hope in a future DSM, they're like, whoops, our bad. Because even if there's, in research, an objective overlap of certain things, the subjective implications, I think, are way too much to ignore. Even if they're accurate and it's only 15% difference, that 15% difference makes a world of difference. Because you better believe when I'm meeting with someone with PTSD with more protracted traumatic experiences, and they still meet criteria for PTSD, and those are often complex cases, they just also happen to meet all the criteria, versus the single incident PTSDs. Those are different beasts. I mean, psychodynamic developmental theories have long mapped, like, when something happens to you, especially when you're younger, it's going to affect object relation development, which affects the entire trajectory of someone's life. It's just wildly different than a single incident, and even repeated events if they occur to you in your 30s, after you have ideally formed a somewhat healthy sense of self. Obviously, when the two combine, those are very, very tragic and very challenging situations. But I digress. So again, coming back to Claude here, the concept of complex trauma, it recognized the ICD, not the DSM, was designed to capture something specific and serious. So here's where we get into semantics. When I say serious, I don't mean like, of course, attachment-related issues and ruptures are serious. And I think Claude gets into this later. We're not saying that those aren't serious, but when we use the word trauma, there's a level of seriousness that we're talking about. And the complex component is the prolonged, repeated interpersonal nature of it. And this is, there's a lot of subjectivity in that, because I can look back to my childhood and very quickly see how relationally challenging things were, and how ways in which my parents related to me did not help my sense of self-development, did not help my emotional development, et cetera, et cetera. And that was a prolonged and repeated exposure. That was not like a one-off here or there. That was kind of how I operated. And so it's very easy to fit ourselves into that language, because that's often how it works, right? We're just subjected to our parents. We're subjected to our environments, our contexts, our cultures. And there's not like an easy escape, which is the next piece. Escape is limited or impossible. You can't escape culture. You can't escape your parents unless they're really receptive to feedback. They're often doing things as they know how to do them. And so it's really easy to fit into that. And so the seriousness component, I think, is the really challenging piece. So we get to Judith Herman, who is the history here of really getting cPTSD recognized. She's trying to include captivity, systematic childhood abuse, prolonged domestic violence. She's trying to push away from the single incident PTSD, this sort of more patriarchal-esque view of trauma through a male lens, that there's more to it than these nice, neat external experiences. There can be an interpersonal component to it, especially at a young age, that disrupts identity. As it says here, profound affect dysregulation, relational dysfunction, altered self-concept. These things are absolutely easily documented and mapped, and deserve recognition. Again, the shame that the DSM is like 85% overlap or whatever they were saying. It's like, oh, no, it's different. It is different. Come on. Now, my understanding, looking around to see if Judith Herman has had any reactions to any of this, it seems as though she's just kind of chilling. She's not really saying that this current extension of complex trauma into like any adversity during childhood is like an okay high five thing, but she's also not, as far as I can tell, saying like is like against it and a voice against this sort of creep that we're going to get into, the concept creep that we're about to talk about. My general understanding she has, beyond systematic childhood abuse, I think she too has like been open to like, hey, there's more to it than these more extreme versions. But the question still remains, even with, Judith Herman not providing input, what is the line in the sand for when childhood experiences stop being technically, clinically, structurally called trauma? And when do we as a society put some sort of line in the sand because of the implications we're about to get into? We're about to get into it. So the next thing Claude says to me is, hey, okay, what you're observing is real and documented. Nick Haslam, forgive me for mispronunciations, work on concept creep. I was unaware of this. Upon entering into this conversation, the most rigorous framework I point you to, he describes how harm-adjacent psychological concepts, trauma, abuse, bullying, mental disorder in of itself expand both horizontally into new categories and, germane to what we're talking about right now, vertically, usually because these are severe terminology, downward into less severe instances being included. Claude unabashedly says this quite strongly. Trauma is arguably the most dramatic recent case. The vertical expansion is particularly relevant here. The lower bound of what constitutes trauma keeps descending, absorbing things that previously had their own vocabulary. The vocabulary I was referencing in my prompt: relational disruption, attachment insecurity, adversity. Here's some heavy ones: ordinary parental imperfection, and even just disappointment about our upbringing and our experiences. Now, I paused here and I looked up Nick Haslam's theory, the concept creep, because part of me was like, oh gosh, this sounds potentially politicized. Everybody's a snowflake now, and there's certain camps that seem to be like, get your shit together, excuse my French, you're just being weak and mopey and blah blah blah. And it's not that, as far as I can tell, which was refreshing to see. This individual seems to say, like, this is like an apolitical, neutral statement that there's a universality to it. This is what happens to any concept. This is part of human nature. Is we take a concept, and as lots of people in the general public, especially in a really interconnected world, engage that topic, the concept naturally creeps. Now, we should be careful and diligent in acknowledging that. We shouldn't just go, well, the concept creeps, there are no ramifications. You need to reckon, and hence this episode, you need to reckon with the impacts of the concept creep. The AI then goes into saying, hey, your observation that attachment issues and neuroses existed before quote-unquote complex trauma is not a trivial point. It's actually diagnostic. Those constructs had their own clinical utility, their own therapeutic implications, and their own causal stories. Subsuming them under complex trauma is not a neutral decision, essentially. It imports a specific frame. Something was done to me. I am injured. My current functioning is a response to violation that doesn't apply equally well across all those older categories. So you'll notice it's being kind of judicious here and saying, like, there's an impact to labeling it trauma. Not saying that it doesn't have shared elements to these other things like relational disruption, attachment insecurities, attachment injuries, ruptures, whatever term we want to use besides trauma. But it is different, right? There is something different internally that happens when we ascribe to one label to another, with, again, the anecdote that the concept creep is happening. And so why and how and what frame within which people are operating when they identify with this creeping concept is very and increasingly hard to understand. But long story short, end of this chapter, Claude is basically saying, like, hey, definition is technically correct. There is a seriousness to this on top of the prolonged, protracted nature of it that is supposed to be what complex trauma is, and we don't have really institutional boundaries or limits around it. It just isn't existing right now. And from that, concept creep is occurring, and from that, there are probably implications. So that's the end of Claude's first response. The second response then kind of dives into this and says, hey, the semantic question, essentially how we divide it, and we'll repeat this eventually, the difference between the clinical world and the semantic societal world. Claude increasingly helps frame the difference between these two. So here we go. It says, the it's just semantics, meet them where we're at position has genuine clinical wisdom. Thanks for the validation. This is, kind of 101 for most of us providers. Like, you can't assume you're on the same page just because someone uses a label or a well-known construct. It is unsafe to assume you mean the same thing. You might want to ask them for follow-up. What does that mean to you? Tell me more, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, if someone organizes a self-understanding around complex trauma and it opens the therapeutic relationship, you don't start intakes with philosophical debates about diagnostic validity. That's just good clinical judgment. And so, it's like, well, what does that mean to you? And remember, there's always this subjective little t trauma stuff that there is indeed. It's not like there's a very clear line for the word trauma itself anyway. And so there's always going to be some latent subjectivity to trauma and what people experience subjectively as trauma, and people are allowed to have that latitude. So it's just good clinical judgment. You don't really make it about this. And if you were listening to what I said earlier, I myself, it doesn't massively change treatment anyway, right? It's not like I need to delineate this beyond for insurance purposes. And that, otherwise I'm going to treat you incorrectly. It's like, nah, there's this collaborative frame around it anyway. Psychodynamic work, again, it's all very similar. It's not the same, but it's still similar. So it's not really that important clinically. It's functional. It's like, what does this mean to you? How does it impact you? Anyway, I'm just repeating myself. All right, so getting back to it. But the dismissal of labels as quote-unquote just semantics is itself a position that doesn't survive much scrutiny, and you clearly sense this. I don't need validation, but labels are structuring. They don't just describe, they shape the object they name, the possibilities available to it, and the social relations around it. And that's not unique to complex trauma, what Claude is offering. That is part of human nature. This is the purpose of labeling universally in the human condition. Ian Hacking, also totally unfamiliar with this individual in this term coming into this, called this the looping effect, that by nature of interacting with a category, it begins to reorganize. People begin to reorganize their self-understanding and behavior around the diagnosis, which in turn then feeds back into how the category develops. It's not a neutral process. I'll keep reading here before I make sort of a reflection on that. A person who understands the relational difficulties as complex trauma occupies a different subject position than someone who understands them as an insecure attachment or a natural consequence of a genuinely difficult upbringing. The first is a patient. The second is an agent with a hard history. There's a little bit of tinge, I feel like Claude went a little too far with that last comment. But I'll save that digression for later. It's not really a digression, but going back to Ian Hacking and the looping effect, there are two things to consider here that are at play with complex trauma. One is that some of this is because the label is given to other people. So this is the provider themselves going, you have trauma, because they're coming in and talking about some sort of childhood adversity, and they are invested in saying, you need to label this as trauma. Now, people do it softer than that. They're like, have you ever considered that could be a traumatic experience? But by virtue of the person themselves being labeled, they then reorganize their understanding around that, which then feedback loops into how the category is understood. And this is kind of the more natural thing. I would bargain when I looked up Ian Hacking, this is the more kind of typical methodology, right? There's a greater system that creates a category, you find yourself in it, and by virtue of finding yourself in it, you begin to influence it. What is particularly interesting around complex trauma is we're in the day and age of social media. And so often this self-identification is indeed exactly that. It is not a provider prompting it. It is people self-selecting into the category. And then organizing their understanding around that self-selection, which then they are influencing a category without technically being put in it. There's something beautiful about that, right? That stopping the gatekeeping effect that can occur is like, well, only a provider can name your experiences is demeaning in a way, because that subjective experience of something being traumatic is indeed important, but it creates a chaos when we're looking at trying to understand a concept for what it is. Going back to the term, it contributes to the concept creep. The concept creep is not just being enabled or encouraged by providers. It is all of society, providers and consumers alike, that are rapidly contributing to the concept creep. So essentially it's saying like, hey, this is all not like a neutral thing. Like there is a creep going on, and there's a difference between the clinical end of the fence and then the implications at a societal level. And so here Claude starts going to the societal level. Now what I offered to it is like, hey, I'm making this term up, but truly the amount of people who say these sorts of things is astronomically different than 10 years ago. My parents traumatized me, or my childhood was traumatizing, and they, a lot of people are like, I'm not saying my parents traumatized me per se, but they definitely they were intentionally traumatizing me, but they did traumatize me, right? Or I think the second thing I said that it didn't put is like, how often past relationships that ended poorly are framed from like a trauma lens, rather than like there was adversity and I'm learning from it, or there were relational ruptures and the co-construction was, not so good and blah, 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 blah. It becomes traumatizing to them. There's a complexity to it. If it's like a 3-4 year relationship, well, it's complex trauma. To which, Claude says, like, first, here are the issues with this. First, the word loses its discriminative power entirely. It no longer marks meaningful distinction between experiences. This isn't a pedantic concern. It has clinical consequences. If everything is trauma, nothing is. And the people with the most severe presentations get lost in a flattened landscape. Now, this isn't all just like, well, we shouldn't do this only because the most severe of cases, right? Thinking statistically, this 2 standard deviation cases get lost in the mist. There is truly a greater concept creep issue than just that. But it is the most, I think, remarkable illustration of like what happens to the normal curve if everything flattens, right? There are no standard deviations. Everything is equally considered trauma. There are huge implications for that, not just for individuals, but for research and for funding and for disability. I mean, all sorts of massive, massive implications. And if you want an analog to this that I think is probably more destructive than trauma itself, it's with autism spectrum disorder, ASD, where there is this insane amount of power creep, concept creep behind it, where this is on the Asperger's, previously called Asperger's side of the fence, where people are identifying as being on the spectrum with no testing whatsoever because they have social eccentricities or personality eccentricities. And what that does is it absolutely dilutes what is autism anymore, what is being on the spectrum anymore, what does being neurodiverse even mean anymore. And I can tell you the people that are true blue, prototypical cases of Asperger's, they are lost in the midst of this. I mean, truly that relativity. There are people who need significant social help and significant help in their day-to-day life who exist on the spectrum, and that is different than someone who has social eccentricities. And so that concept creep, the loss of discriminative power, is a thing. It is absolutely a thing that we should care about, even if, again, we can take a functional lens from a treatment approach. Second, and to me, Claude, that kind of combines. I think second and third points feel very similar to me. So I'll just read through them and reflect. Second, and this is the more interesting problem, how does AI know something is interesting? I don't know. This is the personality overlay that they have, right? But it creates an infinite regress of victimhood with no terminal point. Oof, geez, ouch, right? And this is where I'm like, this gets a little too spicy for my liking. The parent who traumatized their child was themselves probably traumatized by their parent, and so on. The causal chain extends backward indefinitely. And the model produces no one who is simply a fool agent making choices because every behavior is explained by prior injury. The model eats itself. Moral responsibility becomes incoherent. A little too heavy, if you ask me, because I think it's unfair. My experience of people coming in saying, like, I think I have complex trauma is not like pure victimhood and moral responsibility is kind of just lost in it all. And truly, these folks are often, at least 50% of the time, very oriented towards healing. That there is, and I push back on this later, there is something I need to, independent of labels and responsibility, I just need to be raw about it so that I can more intentionally move on. So I feel like it goes a little bit awry here with this one. Can this be the case sometimes? Oh, absolutely. But it says it too firmly. It makes it sound like this is always what happens or was destined to happen. I go, no, the concept creep's not that bad, at least not universally, right? So then it goes into the third point, which feels very close. It may paradoxically close off the very pathways it claims to open. There's robust literature on post-traumatic growth and adversity-forged resiliency. These pathways require that the person maintain some sense of themselves as someone who can be shaped by their experience rather than only damaged by it. If adversity is recorded as trauma, the growth frame is foreclosed. Way too strong again, because you don't grow from trauma, you recover from it. Way too strong again. There's a different relationship to one's own history. If I was to peel back a little bit or pull back a little bit from this, I would say the gestalt, like the holistic, broader understanding of what constitutes trauma does impact our psyches. Right. So if within the concept of trauma, there is this like victim and aggressor mentality that you are powerless at the hands of something, someone who has usually more power than you, and you were thereby just subjected to it. And so there is an inadvertent sort of subtext of victimhood to the word. And depending on the individual, how they wield that within their psyche varies. But this is the problem with concepts creep, is we're leaving that to who knows who, right? Like, how are we going to modulate the impact of that if everyone just kind of freely says, again, a little bit hyperbolic, my apologies, is like, oh yeah, mine's trauma, yours trauma, we're all traumatized, right? Like for some people, it is a dangerous mentality, both because it is inaccurate from a clinical standpoint, and even from a subjective standpoint. If you give the latitude of like, if you want to call that like your own small t trauma, that's okay. However, if that label comes with it, this sort of entitlement to victimhood, that is clinically dangerous. It really messes with things. And again, I think it's not like over half the cases I've seen. I just don't see it. But it can occur. I would 25%, maybe a little bit less, where there is something about that label that shifts responsibility and shifts something about someone's object relations in a way that might not be super helpful, but we get into this later. Okay, that's the end of chapter 2. It's basically saying like, hey, there are real implications here. You can absolutely segment off the clinical stuff, treat from a functional lens. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but the semantics do indeed matter, and there's a multitude of reasons of why that might matter, albeit Claude, I think, goes a little bit too far with some of this. This next one, it talks, it's basically, again, chapter 3, so to speak. There's got to be some parallels outside of psychology. So let's take off, let's move away from this hot topic. Like, say this is like a really challenging conversation. People will kind of get up in arms about it. Well, let's look at something that maybe less in the camp. Is this a thing that happens outside of psychology? And Claude's answer, I mean, as we might expect, is yes, indeed. The most powerful example, I think, is the first one it gives, the ductal carcinoma in situ. Forgive me for not pronouncing that correctly in Latin. I was totally unaware of this as well. Went looking it up. It's basically like quote unquote stage 0 cancer. Cancer that might not even turn into traditionally what you and I would understand to be cancer. You got cancer that's bad, you got to get rid of it because it's going to turn into something bad. And if it remains unmanaged, it will potentially metastasize and then you will die, right? This is not that. And yet it is labeled as a carcinoma. It is labeled under the caption of cancer. And with that, there has been apparently a lot of vigorous debate in medicine around like, this is dangerous. So much so it says mastectomies for what often never progresses. Right? There are implications for taking something very serious and generalizing it. Now, the medical world is a little bit different than the mental health world, right? We're talking about internal object relations and all that stuff. We're talking about literally life or death. So it's not a perfect parallel, but it's an interesting sort of thought experiment to be like, oh, that makes total sense that so if we pull back on the cancer label, it will shift how people treat themselves and understand what they want to do about that thing. And so there's a responsibility to be diligent around the semantics once more. Now, it provides some other examples here that were really compelling. Just as well in linguistics, this idea that, say, for example, the words awful and terrible and horrible were once genuinely strong words, and that inflation over time has created a relativity to them that you and I could say, oh man, that's awful. And it's more just kind of like a turn of phrase that doesn't really capture the emotional sentiment. And so there is this natural drift in language. Now, descriptor words are different than clinical labels, but it's a useful kind of thought experiment because the idea is like, well, at some point, if trauma gets appropriated in this way, we got to come up with a different term than trauma because it becomes meaningless or it's less salient in its meaning because it's no longer a salient word, a really remarkable, more rarely used or selectively used word. In law, the word harassment, I was like, holy cow, hadn't even thought of this. Holy moly. The hostile work environments has also had an analogous expansion. In ecology, the word endangered, right? Endangered species and stuff. All of this, it says, the through line is that when a high stakes label is expanded to increase inclusion, the expansion is usually motivated by something very real. Suffering that was previously invisible or dismissed. Powerful statement, absolutely mappable when we use the word trauma. But the cost is borne asymmetrically. Basically the social cost. So it says where to take all of this. Well, look, the semantics thing, there's not like a right or wrong. On the clinical side, it makes total sense. Functional approach makes total sense. But societal, there's a whole other question here. What do we do? It goes back to the victimization stuff, which again I say is a little bit heavy-handed, and is about to prompt my prompt back at Claude, my prompt back to AI. So it says resilience is partly a relationship to narrative. Absolutely true. Very powerful statement. Very beautifully put. The story you tell about your hard experiences and what they make you. A culture that systematically codes adversity as victimization, which, again, a little too powerful. That was systematically codes any adversity as trauma, is how I would mend that, is running an experiment with resilience at scale. And there are real reasons to think the results won't be good, like when it speaks frankly. Or just like to the point. This doesn't mean to minimize suffering, right? This doesn't mean minimizing suffering. And I'm glad it at least adds this while it's kind of going on about victimization. It means taking seriously the question of which frameworks for suffering actually help people over time and which ones foreclose the hardest earned forms of growth. Now, this is where I push back. This one's like... it's not about diagnostic arguments, but part of a broader professional and cultural conversation about what psychological language is actually for. Now, I push back at this whole victimization, saying like, "Hey, appreciate this, if-then sort of thing," but like, hold on. Many might argue like it's not about victimization, but rather being able to more richly access that which has done harm, right? If we over-intellectualize something, we don't just take it at face value, because we go back to like, you're a 5-year-old, you don't have all this stuff. It's right. It's just a bad feeling. And there's evidence to support. And part of me says I should prompt further, but I don't want this to be like over an hour episode. But just like, you have to address that rawness at like a child level when you were encoding all these kind of dysfunctional object relations that follow to really move to a healing place. So it seems a little short-sighted to assume this is just victimization. It's the only way to heal, right? Like, might this be the only way to heal? I do then poke a little bit and say, I will say social media seems to really... narrowly focus on interventions such as internal family systems is really coming to the fray lately. EMDR for the last decade, it's really been seen, unfortunately, sometimes as a panacea, a cure-all. And I know this not to be conceptually true, but this like all attachment harms have to be indirectly and mystically engaged in some sort of way. And that's going to, and this is a foundational shift in how we work. Like, is it unwise to push against this? Because at the end of the day, everything has to do with relationships, and attachment, which a relational psychodynamic provider is someone who truly believes in. I go, yeah, I mean, half of what I'm doing, if not 75% of what I'm doing, is working through people's past and object relations, which is relational in nature, and thereby is right there cousin to this idea, this concept creep around complex trauma. It's right there, and that makes total sense to me. It makes total sense to me. But at the same time, I see this is partly music to my ears. But then again, there's this tension that resurfaces. It feels way too narrow. It feels unwise. It feels like we're getting somewhere. Like, I'm probably just repeating myself. Help me out. Does this change anything? And so here we get to the final chapter here, chapter 4. Probably should preface this the based on the prompt. It's like, well, look, the only way to heal argument taken seriously actually collapses under its own logic when you push on it gently. A trauma frame is necessary. And, in short, to keep this a little bit on the shorter side, what it's saying is like, it's access to early relational emotional material that's the actual therapeutic goal. Whether or not you name it trauma is irrelevant, minus the concept creep and all the implications thereafter. Excuse me, because all this stuff that we're doing, object relations theory, attachment-informed work, understanding developmental sequences, all that kind of stuff, it all reaches the same territory. The confusion is between the destination and the vehicle. Trauma gets treated as if it's the only road in, when it's actually just the current road with the most visible signage. Now, this might hurt for some folks who are really wed to the idea of complex trauma. It's like, wait, are you calling me out? Which, again, maybe not. It's more just like, what do we do as a society? Right? Holistically, what are our limits to say, like, we're all hunting for the same thing, right? And so maybe the label doesn't matter. But again, there are implications behind the label. And so might there be more than one road to get to the same destination? Might it be healthy? Might it be more complex and more layered to approach this not from such a narrow lens of complex trauma? So the argument you must call it trauma to heal is really you must access the depth and rawness of experience, early experience, to heal it, which is both true and entirely separable from the diagnostic label. The label gets smuggled in as if it was constitutive of the access, when it isn't. So, I hope a lot of people would technically agree with that. But again, I think there's this pushback of like, well, why do you care? Like, just stop being annoying and just let people call it what they want. Okay. Then the IFS EMDR thing, it goes into a little bit of defense of me. I didn't ask it to do so. I'm always suspicious of AI and its validation tendencies. So I'm like, what are you doing right now? Is this truly only objective? But it's interesting. It says like, the expansion of the trauma label, causes a coevolution with these approaches. EMDR and IFS both have their own internal logic for why trauma is the organizing construct. So clinicians trained in those modalities arrive at sessions already oriented to define trauma because their toolkit was built to treat it. The label and the modality mutually select for each other. This also feels a little heavy-handed, but it makes relative intuitive sense, right? I, as a relational psychodynamic person, am always oriented to relationships because that's kind of the nature of the approach. So even if we're going problem solution, I'm always like, wait, relationships and emotions therein, what's going on? So hopefully it doesn't sound too insulting, but really their primary focal area is trauma. How do we work through trauma work? And so there are implications for that, particularly when social media accelerates this and people are identifying as trauma and they seek out these really trauma focused works. So IFS in particular has extraordinary social media uptake. I didn't know this. I mean, I have my suspicions, but partly because it uses language that is self-applicable. The mechanism visible therapies, those with nameable, explainable processes that can be conveyed in a 3-minute video, get selected for spread regardless of whether their mechanism is actually what produces change. And this is where it kind of comes in the defense of psychodynamic folks. Psychodynamic work is nearly impossible to, I always say this word, not commodify. There we go. This way, because its active ingredients are diffuse, relational, and slow. It doesn't make good content, aka social media content. So the social media landscape ends up systematically amplifying the therapies that can be explained in terms of trauma and visible technique, which feeds the cultural sense that this is what modern healing looks like. So it's pushing back on me saying like, hey, I don't know if this is a zeitgeist shift. Now, I think, again, it's a little too heavy-handed. When I collaborate with, and I know somebody's seeing IFS and EMDR providers, there is something about those that really can amplify what it says, like the slow process. It's like, maybe it doesn't have to be so slow. And so there's something being learned from these approaches as far as how rapid they are at really getting to the expressive component of things. Now, how well are they at transmuting things into something else? I don't know. I'm not wholly convinced on that piece of really being very different or uniquely good at that translation process. Again, I don't really know. I feel like they're okay. It's just another approach. I feel like this, to this point, that the more diffuse relational component of psychodynamic work is important in the healing process, because if it took you years to get into this place, it ain't going to take you, half a year of IFS or a year of IFS and EMDR to get you out of it. But the evoking piece, I think, is really alluring to me and makes good sense. So anyway, back to this. This matters clinically because it shapes what clients arrive expecting. And this very much, I think, speaks to a lot of providers who don't provide these interventions, because the expectation is now frequently that healing means accessing trauma through a specific protocol. What you're actually doing is building a reflective relationship with early relational experience over time, which is both more durable and less dramatic. It can feel inadequate against that expectation. Clients may even leave good therapy for the thing that looks like it's doing more. Now, again, I'm on the fence on this. I think that how rapid those interventions will help people access emotions that otherwise they struggle through for years is a thing, particularly when there's a lot of models of therapy out there that feel more atheoretical, or this is not their forte, right? But there is something about gradual work, which is not terribly supported by managed care, might I add too, that does something different internally to object relations than the quicker sort of rapid fire, holy crap, there's a lot of emotions, whoa, what am I doing with this? So again, it feels a little too heavy-handed, but I appreciated it kind of naming these things. So it seems to be kind of repeating itself in some ways, and we'll kind of have to end here. Again, I feel like there's 10 different prompts I should give this thing, but I don't. It doesn't make sense to do 2-hour episodes on this stuff. So we'll see if I make another one, a part 2 or something. Anyway, on the individual versus societal distinction you drew, I did not necessarily draw that. Claude did a little bit of that. It's like here it contradicts itself a little bit. It feels like it pushes back on the harmless at the individual level. Because again, it also said like, hey, treating people functionally is not a big deal. But basically it's saying the whole victimization thing, the move from I experienced things that were hard and that shaped me to I'm someone who is traumatized is subtle but structural. We're talking like internal structures. The first preserves the relationship between self and history, where the self still has authorial standing. So like it still has the power to the ability to author and control, whereas the second makes the self a product of what happened. And recovery becomes about managing that product rather than reconstituting agency. And basically it's saying like, this is a risk. It thankfully this time pulls back a little bit. It says like, hey, it's not universal that this stuff can cause harm, but you can't just dismiss it altogether. So it seemed to soften its victim language from earlier, which maybe it detected based on me like pushing back on it. I don't know. But it's doubling down, at least to the extent of saying like, hey, you can't totally dismiss this. You can't make this a monolith, essentially, is what it's saying, which I do appreciate. And then to the earlier frame, what we were talking about earlier, the thread connecting everything is that complex trauma isn't just, maybe this is probably a final timestamp, I'm not sure. But anyway, the thread connecting everything is that quote unquote complex trauma isn't just a diagnostic category. It becomes the load-bearing concept for an entire therapeutic culture with its own modalities, its own self-help vocabulary, its own social media grammar, and its own theory of what healing requires. That's a more significant thing than diagnostic inflation alone. When a label captures an entire ecosystem of practices, expectations, and identity formations, its societal weight becomes much harder to reverse, even if the conceptual problems with it are clear. The individual clinician working thoughtfully within it, which then validates, doesn't change the population level attractor the whole field is drifting toward. It's drifting, right? There's this concept creep, and there is a part of me that questions like, I don't think we can fully come back from this, and it puts us providers in a really interesting space. I mean, whatever the current fad treatment does shift over the decades. It does, right? As psychodynamic clinicians, I'm young to the field, but I know it has stayed, it stays steady for a reason. It evolves in minor ways, but it doesn't totally reinvent itself. And it probably does that for a reason. And it is wise to do that as we continue to have these kind of spur-offs that sometimes are just recreations of things we already know. Other times they add little addendums to the original approach, and the original OG approaches can just go noted, heard, I can adapt to that. But still, it's this idea of its own ecosystem is like, it's kind of Wild Westy, right? Which part of me loves as a contrary person who loves to disintegrate boundaries and say, who cares what the ultimate authorities say, let's rebel. But there is also danger in that Wild West nature, that the relativity takes hold in a way that is hard to come back from. And there are societal implications we're not even talking about here. Anyway, the psychodynamic resonance you mentioned, but I named the asymmetry. Psychodynamic thinking says early experience matters and shapes present functioning, which is a claim about developmental causation. The trauma frame says early experience injured you, which is a claim about damage. Those are genuinely different, and only one of them has access to the full range of what early experience actually does, including how it generates both vulnerability and the particular forms of strength, sensitivity, and relational depth that come from having navigated the difficulty. Again, a little too heavy-handed because I think it's suggesting some of these other methods don't do that. But I think it's wise in pointing out that more process-oriented interventions, such as psychodynamic thinking, has a fuller range of access. Like when I'm doing trauma work, I'm not only focused on the trauma itself, I'm focused on the whole human being in a way that when I'm exploring the self, I'm not just looking for the parts impacted by and injured by the trauma, but the aspects of self that exist independent of it. And that more gradual, holistic process, I think, does something longitudinally that possibly EMDR approaches and IFS approaches need to evolve and do better with, depending on the clinician, depending on how they're trained. Obviously, with some ignorance here that maybe they do a better job at this than I fully appreciate, perhaps even Claude fully appreciates. So all this to say, if there's a summary to be had, is I say, okay, have we gone too far? And does any of this matter? And Claude basically says, it's possible we're going a little too far and it does matter. Are there caveats to that? Absolutely. Absolutely, right? I began this by saying complex trauma is immensely important in the field. I would never undo the knowledge of complex trauma and the point of access it is providing people beyond traditional PTSD. But in the vacuum of what's the difference between, professionals and social media guiding people of what's the difference between trauma versus these other labels, people are filling that with that which is most accessible. And right now, that is complex trauma and the treatment modalities that encourage this sort of mindset of like, you were traumatized and you need to work through your trauma. At the end of the day, does any of this matter to you if you're an individual seeking help and trying to figure out the labels? No, at the end of the day, there's a universal truth. And the universal truth is no matter what we call it, our early experiences shape us. And that includes any version of adversity or trauma. It shapes us in ways that create unhealthy ways of relating to ourselves and others that benefit from therapy. They benefit from process-oriented therapies that are focused on the past, focused on the self, and it just so happens trauma-oriented interventions can fill that void and fill that niche, but you might want to be sure and be careful that they fill all the niches that you need, that this isn't just about trauma, it is about you and a whole you. And as long as your providers are doing that and you're doing that with your providers and you're seeing some growth, then maybe it doesn't matter at the end of the day. Still, the minute I telescope out beyond a group of individuals, when I get to society at large, we still have to contend with what we want to responsibly call these things, regardless of the reality that there's a gray zone where people can self-select in and out. But clinically, holistically, can we educate ourselves on more than just a trauma lens, that there is more to life, there's more to experience, and there are things that happen to us internally when we label something as trauma versus when we label it something else. So I don't know. Let's see how many dislikes I get on this. I don't know. Even I get to the end of like, oh, there's follow-up questions and there's holes and I don't know if I said everything, but we're hitting 52 minutes here, so I'll have to end there. Again, I'll cynically say get 5% of people watching this past 10 minutes anyway. But if you did stick with me at all, or at least watched or listened to portions of these, thank you for sticking around. And I really mean this, particularly around topics like this. Well, thank you for listening and watching, and please, for real, stay curious.